Okay, so let's get started. We have a lot to cover. So I wanted to welcome everyone. My name is Siobhan Carroll, and I am from Enterprise Health, and I'll be your host today. Thank you all for joining us. For those of you who don't know, Enterprise Health is an award-winning healthcare-focused cybersecurity firm. We provide products and services to assess, remediate, and monitor cybersecurity risks, regulatory compliance programs, organizational resilience, and third-party risk management. Today's webinar will focus on third-party risk management and how to create a successful program. The webinar itself will take about 45 minutes, leaving 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. I'm going to give you a couple of quick webinar tips. Throughout the webinar, we'll keep all lines muted to prevent background sounds. If you need to get in touch with me, please use the chat feature, which is accessible by clicking the chat button that shows up in the bottom middle of your screen if you move your mouse there. Please send your difficulties to me, technical difficulties that is, and I'll be listed as host. If you have any questions that you'd like the presenters to address, please chat them to me whenever you think of them, and our presenters will answer them at the end. After today's session, you'll receive an email from us, and if you're interested in a copy of the slides, please let us know. With that, I'd like to introduce you to our three panelists. Vikas Khosla is Enterprise Health's Chief Digital Health Officer. Vikas has spent the last 15 years focused on healthcare security, privacy, and compliance. He previously was the founder of Blueprint HIT, a 100% healthcare security company. Brian Parks is Enterprise Health's Senior Vice President of Information Security Services. With more than 30 years in healthcare IT and security, Brian has expertise across multiple regulations and security frameworks. And last but certainly not least is Ian Terry, a security consultant at Enterprise Health. Ian has over 6 years of healthcare IT experience and is a graduate of the National Center of Academic Excellence in Cybersecurity, as recognized by the NSA and the Department of Homeland Security. With that, I will let Vikas take it away.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. Welcome everyone today. Just for a little bit of background, Enterprise Health is a full-service, healthcare-only cybersecurity services and software company. With that, we're going to cover our agenda for today, which hopefully will have a lot of meaningful dialogue. We're going to keep it conversational between Brian and Ian and myself, and we're going to really focus and start with defining the problem around third-party risk. I believe most people on this particular call, this particular presentation understand the issue, but we're going to delve into the problems, we're going to delve into the solution, and then we're going to really focus on 5 key elements of a TPR program. We're going to spend the majority of our time there. But then we'll talk a little bit also about current market solutions, how some folks are trying to address the problem specifically around scaling their TPR programs. And then we'll talk about our next generation solution as well very briefly at the end, and then offer some concluding thoughts and then get into Q&A. There will be a lot of discussion, Q&A, and conversation that I'll be fostering with Brian and Ian as we go through this particular agenda for today. So with that, I'm going to bring in Brian Parks, who's going to really start us off by delving a little bit into really the issue of third-party risk and defining the problem.
Thanks, Vikas. So third-party risk management within the healthcare industry it's a relatively new concept, and it's been very slow to mature. Even just a couple years ago, you really didn't hear too much about it, but now it's on the minds of almost every executive as they're trying to get their arms around all the different avenues of risk within their organizations. And why do we have this focus? Well, since 2009, we've seen a steady increase in year-over-year healthcare data breaches, totaling over 3,000 breaches in the last 10, 11 years. Those breaches have resulted in the disclosure of over 230 million healthcare records. So when you think about the U.S. population, that's equivalent to about 70%, so it's pretty significant. Well over 20% of those breaches are attributed to third parties. According to the Ponemon Institute, these breaches result in a cost of over $400 per record for fines, restitutions, and remediation. And aside from the potentially devastating personal impacts of those affected, it represents a large financial stake for covered entities to ensure that third parties are taking appropriate measures to protect their sensitive data. A recent and very public example of this is the third-party breach, I think it was last summer, of LabCorp and Quest. That was over 13 million records. That resulted in millions of dollars in fines, and the vendor, which actually was what we consider a fourth party, so LabCorp and Quest are each considered third parties to covered entities and payers, or providers and payers. And this was a vendor to the vendor, so considered a fourth party. They eventually filed for bankruptcy. The passage of the HIPAA and high-tech regulations has spawned an explosion of technology companies offering products and services to the healthcare industry. All these products and services required covered entities to kind of loosen their reins a little bit on their PHI and put trust in these vendors that store, manage, and process their data to keep that data safe. The HIPAA privacy rule requires that companies obtain satisfactory assurances in writing from its business associates that they will appropriately safeguard the protected health information, thereby requiring the covered entity to institute a management program to oversee their vendors' handling of their data. A good third-party program requires good governance and oversight, meaning that somebody must take responsibility and accountability for owning the program. Couple that with the lack of resources in today's very tight labor market to execute the programs, and really in some cases a lack of expertise in this area, you can start to understand the increased risk that third parties pose to any organization. Ian?
Sure. To essentially to further define the problem of third-party risk, I have here an illustration of what a organization, either a covered entity or business associate itself, what their environment may look like when taking into consideration their potential for third-party risk. Like Brian said, with the proliferation of different vendors, services, and products that seek to aid in covered entities in achieving their objectives, we can see here that it is essential for the organization to integrate with those different vendors and products, which creates kind of a network of vendors and different third parties in the environment. Of course, the risk comes into play when that business associate is actually impacted or compromised by a hacker or a malicious actor. By dint of those interconnections between the organization and the business associate, the organization itself is thereby affected and impacted. And that could happen as a result of either the data itself, their data, the organization's data that was being transmitted or housed externally in the third-party environment, being compromised in a data breach scenario, the service and availability to the organization being compromised, or even the attacker's methodology or attack itself actually traversing through the vendor and getting into the organization's security perimeter itself. Obviously, as we consider the scope that these kind of networks can grow to, we can see that the impact of a single business associate or third party being impacted can actually proliferate well beyond that business associate itself into our organization, as well as throughout the entirety of the healthcare industry.
So the solution to the problem is to implement a good third-party risk management program. Taking control of the situation means implementing a comprehensive program really that ensures your vendors have the proper controls in place to adequately protect your PHI. We'll talk in a few minutes about the elements of a good TPRM program, but it's important to understand the potential risk a vendor could pose to your organization, and you must also verify that they've implemented an effective security program when it comes to protecting your data. Because the vendor solution often involves technology, the responsibility of the program similarly often falls to IT staff. And really that's unfortunate in that IT staff may not have full visibility into the relationship with the vendor. There may be aspects of the service that don't even touch IT. A good example of that might be a records vendor who is coming to pick up healthcare records and take them to an off-site storage facility. IT likely has no idea that that, that is even taking place, that relationship is there. And therefore, if you rely just on your IT staff to recognize where these holes are, then that's one that would be completely missed. Organizations have to realize that in addition to IT, you've got legal, compliance, procurement, really anyone else who has a hand in the vendor relationship needs to take an active role in ensuring the security of the PHI.
So returning to this illustration, we see in this instance, just like many organizations that are currently in the healthcare industry today, have third-party risk management processes in place that attempt to address the risk presented by those third parties. Here we've illustrated a third-party risk management program in place that gives the organization some degree of insight and protection as to the entirety of their third-party environment. However, the issue is that this third-party risk management program is suboptimal and really only gives a certain degree of insight that really doesn't guarantee protection. Ultimately, what any organization really wants to aspire to is an optimized third-party risk management program that takes into account the key components we'll be delving into shortly, thereby instituting a program that gives them in-depth insight as to their third-party environment and gives them the potential to respond to that risk by either mitigating it, transferring it, or in some instances altogether avoiding that risk by opting not to integrate or approach a relationship with that prospective third vendor at all.
So here we have the 5 key components of a third-party risk management program. We've touched on these a little bit through the illustrations from Ian and some of the prior slides, but I want to just touch and go through them here. The first 4, those being good governance, tiering, thorough security assessments, and vendor participation, which I further define as collaboration, all lead to the last one, which is informed decision making.
So Brian, you said we're going to keep it conversational. So first question for you is, some in our audience might be asking, well, why is this the right model to approach third-party risk management? We know that there's no definitive standards in place yet, but we're proposing a model here. Why is this the right model?
Yeah, the details of any individual program might vary from organization to organization, and the various responsibilities may fall on different individuals within the organization. But as a result of our learning and expertise, these are the components that have to be included in some form in every program. They account for all the parties that need to be involved, and they speak to the most prominent challenges that affect organizations with whom we've worked. As we mentioned earlier, governance defines the responsibility and accountability within your organization for the overall management of the program. It defines the rules of engagement and how and under what circumstances you'll share your covered information with a third party. It also ensures that the stage gates in the procurement or contracting process are there to require a security review when appropriate. And finally, it outlines a solid third-party review process that specifies the security requirements that must be met by those third parties.
So Brian, governance means a lot of things to a lot of people. We hear the term used in many different regards. And it's often overlooked because it feels like or seems like a soft objective and maybe even unnecessary. So can you explain a little bit why this is such a key and important aspect of any TPRM program?
Yeah, you're right. We actually do see this a lot. I refer to governance as the rules of engagement for an organization. It's a common sentiment when we first open discussions with a customer that they're like, well, we kind of have our process. It's not well documented, but we have something that we follow. But as we drill in and start to ask a few very simple discovery process questions, the importance of defining that governance and those rules really becomes obvious. Simple things like who in the organization is responsible for overseeing the entire vendor management program. Often you get blank stares when you ask that question. How do you ensure a vendor has a solid security program in place to protect your data? And what's the approval process for engaging with the vendor where PHI is concerned? In other words, who's accountable and responsible for that relationship? These types of questions very quickly expose the organization's process deficiencies.
Great, thanks for that explanation. So in the context of TPRM, Ian, what happens when you overlook governance? You know, what's the downside here?
Sure. Like Brian said, we have experienced scenarios a lot where an organization's governance program is suboptimal or in some instances not introduced whatsoever. And I think what we most commonly see is really the lack of that clear delineation and definition of roles and responsibilities as they relate to the third-party risk management program ends up in a scenario where everyone's essentially playing some kind of responsibility hot potato, where everyone's kind of trying to pass the buck or pass the responsibility to someone else, or no one really knows who should be accountable for oversight or maneuvering through the process itself, until eventually there's no actual work getting done and everyone's kind of in a panic to catch up.
Gotcha. Terrific. And I know that kind of leads very much into our next topic that we're going to drill into around tiering and prioritization.
Yeah, and this is one component that is often overlooked, tiering and prioritization. You can think of it as categorizing the vendor. Understanding the potential threats that might be posed by a third party can play a large role in how you engage with that vendor. Setting a tier then allows you to, A, ask the right questions of the vendor during an assessment, and it informs the level of risk you might be willing to accept. For example, if a vendor is not touching payment card data, just pull that one out, and has minimal exposure to only a very small amount of PHI, maybe less than 500 records, you might be willing to move forward with that vendor even if a couple of their security controls are a little bit lacking, something like multi-factor authentication. You know, if those are not quite up to speed, you know, you might be willing to move forward if you're going to put a remediation plan in place. But understanding up front how you would categorize that vendor can help you to get through that whole process and better understand it on the back end.
Yeah, and I think tiering, as we'll see as we move through this, really sets up a lot of the process as we go through it. So in your experience working with clients, how many tiers, is there a standard for the number of tiers, how you define those tiers? Are there some just general best practices around that?
Yeah, there's really no one standard. We have some customers that do no tiering at all. They treat every vendor, put them on the level playing field, assess them exactly the same way, while others that we've talked to have 9 or even more tiers. Categorization is important to understand the type of relationship you have with the vendor, but I think that once you get over 3 or 4 tiers, you might start to lose a little bit of value. The goal, remember, is to understand the type of relationship that you have, the potential risk level for that vendor, and then you move forward accordingly with the assessment at the right level for both the organization and for that vendor.
Terrific. So we'll move on from tiering. As we mentioned, tiering really ties into driving a lot of the next process, and I know that Ian's going to talk to us about security risk assessments, an area that he has a lot of passion about.
Yeah, absolutely right. Security risk assessments, how do they factor into third-party risk management? Certainly they are, like you said, one of my favorite aspects of the whole program, because this is where you are really going to delve in deep with those vendors and evaluate their security programs, essentially to execute a thoughtful and thorough evaluation of their security controls and their security posture. This is an opportunity in the process where we can apply known frameworks such as the NIST CSF, for an example, and additionally apply our own standards as an organization, our own policies, processes, and standards against those of the vendor to ensure that our ultimate objectives are aligned and we are getting the security treatment of our data and our relationship that we would expect internally in one's own organization. This is also the opportunity where we can seek to understand the potential risk, liability, and exposure that a prospective vendor's security posture could present to the organization. And in some instances, attempt to derive understandings of how we can approach those risks, either to mitigate, transfer, or avoid altogether, and what exactly those remediation steps would look like. Ultimately, ascertaining and documenting all the information needed to present to that independent body within our organization for final review and approval, really seeking to equip them with as much information relevant to that decision-making step as possible.
So, I know you love security assessments, but to be honest, questionnaires tend to be the bane of everyone's existence. They tend to be large and significant in many cases. What are some tips you can provide to our audience as to how they can speed up the process of dealing with assessments, but also do it in a way where there's validation as well as a high level of assurance?
Sure. Yeah, and you're absolutely right in that questionnaires tend to compose many of the security risk assessment methodologies employed by organizations because it is an effective tool. However, in order to speed up the process, one approach that we think is a really good one is a modular approach, wherein by utilizing some of the insight derived from the tiering and prioritization process, we can tailor the questionnaire to best fit the nature of the engagement and the vendor itself. That way, we're essentially trimming or extending onto the questionnaire and the attempts to derive and seek out information to exactly the parameters necessary, potentially reducing the unnecessary level of work without having a sizable impact on the level of assurance. And altogether, this could result, and does result rather, in better validation because we're spending less time digging through potentially irrelevant minutia that doesn't actually speak to the nature of the engagement in order to reach a reliable and accurate conclusion as to the levels of risk presented.
Terrific. And that ultimately, that better validation is what then ultimately gains that deeper level of assurance for the organization. Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. And I know it's going to lead right into your next topic around vendor participation.
Right, and this kind of speaks directly to your statement about the questionnaires being the bane of the vendor's existence, right? Because one of the biggest challenges to any third-party risk management program is really cultivating that vendor participation. Of course, in order to move through the process, we need the vendors to be collaborating and responding to our requests, to the organization's request for information, and really playing their role as it relates to the third-party risk assessment process. So, vendor participation is really important, and we should expect our vendors to be engaged and willing to share that information about their security program, be those technical documents related to the controls in place, documentation of the program as it relates to policies and processes and procedures, and then give us the opportunity to actually go ahead and validate the degree of implementation and verify that they're actually adhering to their security program by availing all of this information to us.
So we know that no security program is perfect, and oftentimes a vendor can sort of want to project a certain type of a security program that they think their potential customer is looking to see in terms of their responses. So what would you say to business associates, to vendors about the need to provide meaningful responses, and why should this be important to the vendor?
Yeah, importance to the vendor, certainly a good point, because I think that vendors should realize that this process, the requirement for them to engage in third-party risk assessment processes is not something that's go away. If anything, it's becoming more and more prolific. So as a result, I think that without a doubt, putting an emphasis on that meaningful interaction, those meaningful responses, and exemplifying a willingness to quote-unquote play ball and do the right thing as it relates to facilitating the third-party process goes a really long way to establishing trusted relationships, and certainly, demonstrates that you as a vendor are, willing to foster a trustful relationship should the organization opt to proceed with a contract or integration.
Well, I think as you're saying, transparency, honesty, and that desire for trust, I think will go a long way for a lot of vendors.
Absolutely.
So is it, we know security questionnaires for the vendors are like death and taxes, right? They're inevitable. So we talked about meaningfulness, but let's talk a little bit about what are some of the things that they can do to better prepare themselves for the inevitable questionnaires that are coming their way. Oftentimes, this is very painful for them from a resource standpoint. So what are the things that they should be doing to really prepare themselves and be ready and lighten that burden?
Yeah, like I said, this process really isn't going away for those vendors. So it would really behoove them to familiarize themselves with third-party risk management processes and attempt to centralize and kind of package up all the documentation, streamline their processes as they relate to responding to these kinds of requests to take their role in the third-party risk management process. One particular strategy that could speed things along for both the organization and reduce the operational burden of the vendor itself would be to either seek to utilize an established and known framework around which to build their security program that will help ease the effort needed on the organization side to assess their security program, or seek to obtain a certification, a known certification that acts as a testament to the quality and effectiveness of their security program. To a degree, standing in place with that back and forth, occasionally cumbersome security assessment process, just kind of furnishing that certification and saying, hey, we've been evaluated and by a known, reputable organization, and here's a testament to that.
Yeah, and I'd add too, just referring back to the previous slide about security risk assessments, and even before that, talking about tiering, putting a good tiering process in place, I think also in some way, incentivizes the vendor to collaborate more. If you make it known to them, that, hey, if you've got one of these certifications, high trust, for example, if you are high trust certified and you can provide that information to us, we know that through the tiering and categorization process, and therefore our questionnaire, our interaction with that vendor is going to be much easier, much quicker. So in that way, I think all of that kind of works together to incentivize everybody to really understand the process and help each other along. And I think, at least from what we've seen to date, vendors do appreciate that. They appreciate not having to answer a million questions that don't apply to them. And they're much more willing to collaborate with us in order to get to the end state.
So are we saying that if they have a SOC 2, a high trust, if they've fully demonstrated adoption of NIST, that they get a free pass? That's it? We're going to just move right through to the next stage of approval?
Not necessarily, I would say, but that goes, that's 90% of the way there, and then we can take that and structure that assessment or tier them accordingly so that we're only doing as much work as really necessary by that organization's expectations.
Yeah, we look at, data flows. Every implementation at every customer, even if you have, a solution that you're selling, each implementation might be a little bit different depending on the security rules in place at that customer. So even if they have these things in place, these certifications, you still want to take that next step and understand what it will look like for the customer.
And I know you guys in our team, we look for also their last assessment to look for whatever gaps that they may have.
Right.
No program is 100% as we know. Well, terrific. I think that really sets us up very nicely to talk about one of the most critical aspects of this, and I know, Brian, something that you're very passionate about in terms of our next topic.
Yeah, I think the process that we've talked to so far, those first 4 elements, they kind of culminate in a solid, informed decision-making process regarding the vendor. You know, if we're executing well on those other key components that we've discussed, you know, governance, tiering, the risk assessment, making sure we have good vendor participation and collaboration, that really paves the way for the decision-making body to have a solid understanding of the service or the solution and puts the information they need, such as, you know, whether it's insights, trends, metrics, readily available documentation and reporting, puts it at their fingertips so that they can very quickly and effectively make the right decision for the organization.
So an organization may have put an independent body in place and has all the tools it needs for informed decision-making and has followed a process, but we know that, you know, oftentimes business owners may feel this urgency where they potentially could try to influence and or make requests that can introduce greater risk into the organization. What are some of the techniques you've seen or helped implement that create a sense of responsible ownership on the behalf of these particular business owners, again, who have this great urgency to implement their selected vendor solutions?
Yeah, and I'll refer actually all the way back to governance, which is where it starts. And you know, an appropriately structured independent decision-making body or committee made up of the right members can ensure that the needs of the business are considered when they're reviewing and making those decisions. And certainly the business needs need to be at the forefront of everybody's mind. Having the right governance rules in place makes that decision-making process very transparent. It allows the business owners to understand, to be part of the entire process, and it places the right level of responsibility back on the business owner to understand and potentially have to accept any risks that have been found. It also enables the organization to move forward as one body. Everybody's marching to the same tune, with the same understanding of the solution and the associated risks. For example, decisions on whether remediation of any risks required by the vendor, either before or after engaging with them, it's clear and obvious because you've set the rules in place. As you go through and try to make that decision, you can look at what potential risks there are, and everybody should be on the same page with getting to that decision. You touched on it a little bit, but let's recap maybe if you could for us. Who do you recommend be on this independent committee that's there for approvals? Yeah, you know, again, it depends, right? The answer may vary for each organization, but we generally see membership from legal and or procurement, certainly compliance, you know, as the kind of the police officer in the building there needs to have a seat at the table, as does the CISO or, you know, whoever that designee is. They have a critical voice. And then certainly somebody from IT with responsible for IT security, they also need to be there. You may also include others, either full-time or on an as-needed basis, but I'd caution against spreading that net too wide because you can get to a point where you just start to hinder the process with too many voices. So in terms of approvals, and obviously it could be denials as well, but in terms of the approval process, how do you ensure a good outcome? Yeah, so a good outcome starts with gathering that important information up front. We talked about tiering and categorization, and during the assessment, as Ian was talking about. The assessment report itself, and I use report in air quotes, you know, however the results of that assessment are delivered, they need to be concise, but they also need to contain all the information that is needed by the committee to make the decision. Decisions can come either via the committee meetings, you know, live, face-to-face, or via electronic collaboration like email, or maybe there's a workflow application where you route the approvals. Something like Microsoft Teams, things like that can be very effective. But it shouldn't be a cumbersome process. Remember, you know, we're trying to get business done. And so you want to make good decisions, and you want to have a good report that clearly outlines the decision maker, so that the decision makers can quickly and easily evaluate the results of the vast majority of the assessments without prolonging the process. Terrific. Thank you very much. So as we look back a little bit at the 5 components here that we talked about our model, again, I think, you know, the point is that this doesn't need to be the only way to do it, but these are certainly the key components that should be part of any process that you may implement, ultimately leading to that informed decision making.
So wonderful. So with that, we're going to move on to our next section, which is really to talk about what's going on in the market and how are people addressing TPRM programs, what are some of the solutions that they're implementing, and Ian is going to take us through both some of those manual processes, things that people are doing on their own, as well as some software solutions that are emerging in the marketplace.
Right, thank you, Vikas. And I will start off by talking about some of manual process, a manual approach to the concept of third-party risk management. And this is the type of approach of which I'm sure we're all very familiar, because it relies on tooling and methodologies that we're either currently using or have used in the past, which utilizes things like Microsoft Office tooling, that being Excel spreadsheets, Microsoft Teams for collaboration internally or even externally, ticketing systems, all existing, just kind of an amalgamation of different tools and methodologies that are tied together as a kind of manual approach to third-party risk management. Some things to consider is that in a lot of instances and for a lot of organizations, this is actually a really good potential starting point if they don't already have a third-party risk management program in place, being that we're, in most instances, utilizing tools that we already have access to, which translates directly into lower overhead and ease of implementation if we don't have to onboard new staff or integrate new solutions in order to support that program. However, there are also some drawbacks. Primarily, manual processes like this do not really effectively scale. So in a lot of instances, we see organizations processing upwards of 100 assessments or more in a single year. So attempting to apply a manual process to that, the only way to really respond to that degree of scale is by throwing more and more resources at it, specifically personnel. So it definitely exemplifies a high resource effort needed. There are some challenges as it relates to actual collaboration across the supply chain. We're relying solely on emails to share questionnaires, going back to the security risk assessment process, phone calls, emails. A lot of different disparate communication streams can pose a lot of difficulty and challenge to an organization, especially trying to implement a manual process to respond to a large scale operation. And additionally, in a lot of instances, the organization will utilize a questionnaire that only relies on that one-size-fits-all approach, which really doesn't get to the benefits previously described as it related to utilizing that modular approach. It's just another example of how the manual process, the primary challenge is really scaling that out. But a key takeaway regardless is that because it's the responsibility of every covered entity to institute a well-defined program that has accurate accounting and monitoring of third parties and the data, a manual process is certainly a great first step and can serve to serve the challenge itself. Of course, on the other hand, we have software-only solutions, and there's kind of three different primary categorizations of these I've listed out here. I'll start off with technical scanners. These are products that are much like vulnerability scanners in that they will utilize a purely technical means to evaluate the security posture of an organization, specifically as it relates to their technical infrastructure. So these would usually only consider the web-facing, external-facing technology using scans and crawlers, and don't necessarily holistically assess the full security program. In that instance, I'm speaking directly to things like policies, processes, and really just kind of the whole culture of security that a vendor might be attempting to cultivate. There's also something I have labeled as shrink wrap solutions, which are kind of just drag and drop products that one can integrate into their organization to support a third-party risk management program. The challenge there being primarily that internally, we need to staff and resource the use of those solutions themselves. So the product generally doesn't come along with a service-oriented model that also provides expertise directly to serve a third-party risk management process. And in a lot of instances, they're very limited in their ability to adapt to one's organizational processes and don't necessarily address governance rules and challenges specific to one's organization. Lastly, they're speaking directly to that challenge of the lack of addressing the governance rules are, of course, GRC tools, governance, risk, and compliance tools and platforms that really, do to an extent holistically assess the internal security program and are a valuable tool for security departments within organizations. However, they're very, because of their general vastness, they're very expensive to implement and support, resource intensive to maintain, and generally the third-party risk management component only exists as like a module that one would add on. So it's pretty obvious that with a GRC platform, third-party risk management is not really going to be the primary focus.
And I know for healthcare, obviously, these are sort of horizontal platforms, so there's that potential, that quote-unquote build-out as well for a healthcare-specific TPRM solution.
Right.
So being the root cause thinkers that we all are, obviously we decided as an organization to start to think about what is the right way, sort of that next generation solution around attacking this thing at scale, as you identified, but with having all those components that we discussed earlier. So Ian, maybe you can take us through sort of a before and after of what we think, a potential solution to this could be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have here illustrated that manual process to which I was currently previously speaking, where we have the introduction of that new contract, new product or service, ultimately that new vendor that needs to go through the third-party risk assessment process, being passed along to our internal assessor, who are tasked with collaborating with the third party and utilizing those tools, email, Microsoft Word, Office, Excel, file shares, etc. All these different disparate toolings and methodologies to support the program and ultimately furnish a report that's passed along to that independent decision-making body who have the responsibility of approving or denying the continuation of that relationship. So with Enterprise Health Blueprint Protect, we reorganize the same entities, the same personnel, and the same processes, and attempt to centralize all of the interactions into the product itself. So we see here the internal personnel are able to begin that assessment process by introducing that prospective new vendor, that new contract, et cetera, directly into the application. The third party representatives themselves, the vendors, are able to access the application and provide their information directly into the portal. And finally, the IH assessor, the Enterprise Health Assessor, is able to conduct the assessment within the context of the application. And because everything is centralized in this manner, the organization itself actually has a white box, very transparent insight as to where everything is, status tracking as it relates to individual assessments, as well as the entire program itself. And the security committee or the decision-making body have the ability to evaluate the report as well as all of the different evidences and documentation that is connected to that final creation of that report. So they're really able to make those informed decisions that are ultimately the goal.
Perfect. And those assessments, where IH assessor, obviously there could be a mix of us as well as our clients in terms of doing those assessments, potentially based on tiers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that feature speaks directly to that lack of a hybrid product service model in the marketplace, which certainly organizations can really derive a lot of value.
Terrific. So as we think about sort of tying a bow around this and tying it all together, as we look at, obviously we have worked with our customers around the process, around the solutions, but also tying it back to what we consider a best-of-breed model, a best practices kind of model of the way that this should work, ultimately leading to informed decision-making. So as we've thought about that, as we've done that, I know that there have been, a lot of opportunities for our team, you guys specifically included, to help our software development team to really think about this kind of a platform that is really services driven. So do you have any sort of last second thoughts, anything you want to share about the design process or anything that you've done in terms of the development efforts that ultimately have led to the development of this particular platform?
I think ultimately, relying on those key elements, those key concepts, and just connecting the development of the product around those. Vendor participation is, like we had said, one of the biggest challenges, and giving a centralized platform where we can invite the vendor, we can invite the governance structure, we can perform the security risk assessment, and expose all of that information directly to the decision makers to obtain that informed decision making. I think utilizing that as a basis really made developing out the product very obvious in how to approach all of those challenges.
Terrific.
Yeah, and with my process background, I would add that being able to have a good workflow and a process helps the organization understand, if they've got 100 or 200 vendors, understand where they are in the process, if there's some being assessed. We really didn't touch on reassessments, but that's a critical piece. Every so often, say every year, your vendor should be reassessed because their program, their solutions change, vendors merge, they buy, they get bought up. So looking at them every year is, I think, really important, and having a good platform that can track the status of every vendor, where they are in that cycle, I think provides really good insights for the organization.
Well, thank you. And certainly, we're presenting our solution here. There are certainly other ways to address this as well, some of which we've talked about that others can, take advantage of. But certainly, this is our solution to how to address this. So with that, thank you both very much. We're going to move into the Q&A section of the presentation. And with that, I'll hand it back to Siobhan.
Thanks, guys. That was great. I just wanted to remind people that if you want to send questions to us, the presenters can answer them, and there's the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you mouse over it, or sometimes on some screens it can be on the right, and then we'll be able to see. We do have a couple of questions already, and I will give you your first one, which is, can you be more specific about the modular approach to an assessment?
Yeah, I think I can take that one. Going back to the modular approach to the assessment, to the questionnaire, we already talked about the value and the advantages of restructuring the approach to speak to specifically to the nature of an implementation or a vendor's particular product. So to speak more specifically to how that would manifest in a real-world scenario, the methodology to be applied to assessing something like a hosted cloud service against something that exists solely in the tangible evaluation of physical PHI, there's totally different approach and a totally different lens that really needs to be applied to those two separate vendors. So that's a very high level, black and white visualization, but we can construct different approaches, be those questionnaires or a security assessment methodology that doesn't use a questionnaire, just modularly tack on components that speak directly to something like a cloud-hosted service, or something that would directly speak to the risks presented by the transactions of physical PHI. In that instance, it might be, what is your physical security posture, what kind of personnel screening is performed, and whereas the hosted solution approach would be much more inquisitive on the aspects of their technical infrastructure.
And management.
Exactly.
Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so I think, specifically referencing that term modular kind of struck me, and Ian explained a couple of different ways that can happen. as you think about your assessment, you have to think about the different types of or different pieces of the program that you want to look at. And Ian gave a very good example of, the cloud host versus something that's more physical in nature. But if you look at it and look at each piece of the assessment and kind of break it into sections, then it becomes much more consumable, both for the vendor and for the organization to understand how that assessment is being progressed.
In that sort of manual mode, that could potentially be different tabs within the spreadsheet that sort of, you pick and choose which ones apply. PCI, you gave an example before, that may or may not apply, obviously, to everyone. In a more elegant, sort of scaled up way would be sort of the platform that would be deciding that based on tier levels and so forth. So, yeah, a couple of different ways to slice it, but modular obviously would make it easier on everyone. Fewer questions to send, fewer questions to respond to, fewer questions to assess and validate. Siobhan?
Yep, we've got another one in regarding tier assessments. Can you show an example of ancillary verifications we should check for when a vendor is already SOC 2 certified? That's a good one.
So SOC 2 reports, I'm sure the asker of the question has already been presented with a lot of SOC 2 reports, which can be certainly, very valuable to an assessor to gauge, the implementation of different security controls into the product. And generally that's mostly on a technical level. However, to the credit of a SOC 2 report, it also speaks to the processes and procedures that underpin the security posture of a potential product or a vendor as well. However, I think that in addition to merely examining that SOC 2 report, I think that it's important to have a discussion directly with that vendor or target questions and assessments to that vendor that speak specifically to the nature of the engagement with your organization itself. Because every actual implementation of a potential service or vendor or product is different. So a SOC 2 doesn't necessarily speak broadly to exactly how your organization will be utilizing the service. Certainly you can derive a lot of information, but I would say that 10 to 20% that's missed that speaks directly to the idiosyncronous nature by which you're utilizing the process or the service rather, and in some instances that could actually be the most valuable aspect.
Yeah, for sure. And you also have to think about, a 200-page SOC 2 report, right? There's a lot of information in there, and the chances are that, as you said, 80–90% of it is going to be covered with what you would be asking anyway, but you still need to do that mapping. You need to map the information that you need to map that back to the SOC 2 to make sure that those questions are being answered effectively.
And I guess this is a little bit where validation comes into play here, where you're drilling deeper to the question that was just posed of what are those external assessments, other things that they've done, what are the things around that SOC 2 that help to inform the structure of that security program that they put in place. And again, for sure, looking at always asking for the latest assessment so that you can understand where their less than security program, because there's no perfect in security, where the gaps and those risks might be that either are relevant or not relevant to the idiosyncratic nature, as Ian, as you were saying. So yeah, hopefully that provides some context for that question, Siobhan.
Okay, and then I think this will be the last one. How much education or discussions do you have with business owners to make them understand the importance of a proper assessment? This is our biggest challenge and pressure point.
Yeah, and that's very common, I think. So the business, to be quite frank, the business owner doesn't really care so much, right? I mean, they want to get business done. They want to engage with the vendor. They want to move on. They have to understand, though, the whole reason that you're going through this assessment. So there is an education aspect there, and you want to talk to the business owners, of which, and remember, in a large organization, you can have hundreds of business owners. For each one of these different solutions, it can be a different business owner. So you have to provide some high level of education. Everybody, as I said earlier, has to be bought into the governance and the process, and they need to understand that. They need to understand why. They don't necessarily need to understand every piece of the SOC 2 report that is being provided, and they don't have to understand every single question that the assessor is asking and everything that the assessor is looking at, but they do need to understand the process, why it's there, and on the outcome side, they need to understand the risk, because ultimately, if they're engaging with that vendor, they have to have skin in the game as far as taking ownership of that risk.
So by that, do you mean they literally have to own the risk and whatever the financial or quantitative sort of value associated with that risk? Are we seeing that happening in the marketplace?
I would say yes. And again, I go back to every organization is different, right? And it's amazing all the different organizations that we talk to, how they all view it a little bit differently. But in all cases, compliance has to sign off, because if there is risk there, there is a risk group typically associated in some way with compliance. They'll have to sign off, but they typically tell the business owner, you understand this risk, and they put it on the business owner to accept that risk. A lot of times there'll be caveats for, we'll accept this risk, but we're going to force the vendor to remediate those risks at some point in the near future. But yes, business absolutely has skin in the game.
Terrific. So with that, I think a great place to end. And Siobhan, I don't know if you have any last thoughts about the presentation.
I do. I wanted to thank everybody for joining us. And if you have any other questions for the presenters or want to learn about enterprise health security offerings, please email Suzanne Edison at sedison@enterprisehealth.com, or visit our website at www.enterprisehealth.com, where you'll find resources and more information about our capability. So thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.